So I'll hand it over to you, Cameron. I'll let you take it away.
Yeah, absolutely. So thanks for coming, everyone. So my name's Cameron Blackwood. I'm a software engineer and, funnily enough, a former technical recruiter. So I have a bit of a weird career story that I won't go into on this webinar, because there's plenty about it in my other content. But you may have come across me, probably more likely in my capacity as the founder of the Coder Career, which is a network for developers to pick up basically anything that's a non-technical skill that helps you advance your career. I'm here to help you with that. So we have a podcast, we have a TikTok account, which has been interesting getting used to, and a variety of other basically streams of content. We are also in the future as well potentially going to launch a service to connect you with jobs, basically a job platform with vetted with jobs that we kind of approve of, but that's kind of TBD and still in development. I'm also a software engineer at Holland & Barrett, who are always looking for developers across a variety of skill sets. So we are, always interested in hearing from people that are looking for something new. So don't hesitate to reach out to me if you're interested in jobs with us. But without further ado, I'm going to get into Remix or Remix Run. It seems to go by two names. So for anyone who's not really familiar, because many aren't, because it's a new technology, I'm going to give you a brief overview first into what it is. So it's more or less a React project. So it's a team from React Router. So the vast majority of React developers, I would imagine, have touched React Router at some point. It's a great way of being able to keep track of all the different components in your project and route your users to the exact right place. If I'm building, even to this day, if I'm building a small website using React, then React Router is my go-to. As you probably know, the team behind there is they're very legit, like they're open source gods almost, I would say. So it's very exciting to see all these huge names in the React ecosystem come together to create Remix. So it exited beta last year. Because it used to actually have a paid model, so you would pay to use it on a licensing basis, but now they're using the MIT model of open sourcing. So anyone anywhere in the world can access it, which I think we can all agree is a good thing, particularly with how exciting this is. So you may be saying, what is this? Is this something brand new? Are there any competitors on the market? And yes, I would say Next is probably the biggest competitor, which obviously is a little bit more established. You may well have heard, you're much more likely to have heard of Next versus Remix, and Gatsby as well, although it's not a direct competitor in terms of the offering being slightly different. You could also make comparisons over to Gatsby. So Remix uses server-side rendering, or SSR, which is really ideal for SEO, so search engine optimization. So if you just want your website to appear high in Google, anything using SSR is a good bet. So the reasoning for that is it renders on the client side. It renders on the server side the other way. So instead of rendering on the client side, a document is rendered through the server, which means for the indexes like Google, it's all already available. And also, as an added bonus, in theory, you could actually have your JavaScript disabled for whatever reason and still use and still have full functionality. That's how powerful SSR actually is. So it can be used with either JavaScript or TypeScript out of the box. This isn't a JavaScript versus TypeScript talk, but I would suggest TypeScript. We're hitting the point in the ecosystem now where it's super mature and most people are choosing TypeScript by default. And for reasons I'll go into later as well, this is typically well suited to large scale projects. So I would say, as a general rule, the larger project, the greater degree that you'll need type safety. So that's why I'd recommend using TypeScript. But if you want to use JavaScript, perhaps if you're newer to learning to code in general and you haven't picked up the TypeScript side of things yet, then you can absolutely go nuts with JavaScript as well. So basically, it aims to be an out-of-the-box full-stack web development solution. So it provides you with all the tools you need to basically get going and create a modern, scalable web application. So it's very exciting, and it can really provide you with all the tools you need to actually set up some kind of even business, which is pretty exciting in the sense of it all just being in one repository. So there's a lot of potential, and that's why I'm so excited about it, basically. So why should I use Remix? So dealing with data, obviously that's a critical part of create, read, update, delete applications, which is the vast majority of what people work on, right? So it's ideal when you're talking about highly dynamic data. So in a large scale application where you're getting lots of data changing, which means that, in theory, there's going to be a lot of requests and responses. It's very efficient for that as well. So the example they use in their documentation, for instance, is if you're generating invoices, for example, for a lot of different software as a service clients, it's very useful for that because there's a few factors that are going to keep on changing. For performance reasons as well, the server is actually configured to send a cached response, so something that's stored, unless the underlying data changes. So obviously that saves resources, which is obviously ideal if we're talking about saving costs, if we're running it on the cloud or on-prem for that matter. And also as well, it obviously makes it much quicker, which is ideal if the customer's on a slower connection. So in general as well, something to go into is that this is much better for people who are on a slower connection, which, we talk about. We're in the West and we have very good infrastructure, but not everyone does. So it's very important to consider that when you're making something scalable, especially if it's a worldwide product. You must consider that perhaps not everyone has access to the fastest internet, which means that, you have a duty to serve those users, and Remix is great for that. So let's talk about routing as well. So for people who aren't really familiar with routing, because I recognize we've got a number of different kind of levels of people who are on here in terms of experience. Routing is basically what comes after the URL, so what goes where, basically. So if you're familiar with NextJS, dynamic routing works in a similar way. So what I want to do here is I'm going to show you a little example of what I mean by this next point. The file structure maps directly to the routing structure, including parent-child relationships. So hopefully this will work. Let's have a look at this. So do you see here, I've got my VS Code open here. Do you see routes? So everything under here will then map directly to that domain. So whatever /join will then render this join component, but it works nested as well. So whatever /something/notes /new will then render that component. I hope I'm making sense here, because that didn't entirely come out as I intended. But that's basically what I mean. So it's very simple in the sense that it all maps. We don't have to have some kind of root component that in the index that tells you, manually basically where things need to be. It's a massive time saver. It prevents bugs, and also as well, it just looks pretty nice. So for those of you among us who have had to deal with incredibly messy /spaghetti file structures in the past, then this will be a godsend, really. So that is how the file structure works. You may have noticed as well that there was a $sign there. So what that means is you can basically use URL parameters as variables within components. So for example, you could stick a user ID there, and then that could generate different stuff for a user dashboard. Something that I just missed out in the nested routing there that's quite important as well is that child components are going to inherit UI rules from the parent as well. So if you assign certain styling and UI rules to a component higher up in the tree, further down the tree, as long as it's under that root, they will follow the same rules. So that means you're not going to have to repeat yourself. And as we know, DIY, don't repeat yourself, is one of the most critical rules of software engineering for so many reasons. And splats as well. It's a lovely name. Basically, if you add a *.jsx, so JSX being what we use in React to basically write our components. So it's almost, if you're not familiar, it's basically a mishmash of HTML and JavaScript or TypeScript. So these splats, you can basically use them as a fallback. So every time you go for a root, if that root doesn't exist, because as I mentioned before, you'll have these, you'll have the defined roots. So for example, the notes/new, if I put notes/hello world, for instance, that doesn't exist. It's not defined. So instead of it crashing the app, what I would do is I would have an asterisk.jsx or TSX. That will then create a fallback, so we can, probably render a 404 page is probably the most likely thing to do there. So if people who aren't familiar, 404 is basically the resource is not found. It's a friendly way of telling the user, look, you're looking for something that isn't here, and here's where you should probably go. Go back to home or whatever. We obviously always want to make it clear to the user what's going on, and there's little things like that just make it easier. And 404s can be a little bit of a pain to configure sometimes. So the fact that it just comes out of the box is just one less thing to worry about. Generally, the philosophy of Remix is just to make things quick and easy, and just not have to think about the things you shouldn't really have to think about. So I think we can all get behind that philosophy, I'm sure. So we're talking forms and actions now. So forms are pretty different from what you may be used to if you're an established JavaScript / React developer. So Remix uses basically uses the native HTML like form functionality, which means it actually has a post handler. So what you'll often find is if you're experienced in developing in React, you're going to probably end up using Formic or React Hook Form. Developing in native React, so to speak, and using forms is a very, very painful process to go through. Even if it's a basic form, it's known as one of the weakest points of React. And I know when I was learning React, it was probably the hardest thing. And I discovered actually React Hook Form early on. And actually a fun fact about me, my first ever open source contribution was fixing a spelling mistake on the React Hook Form website when it was still very new. So, you're never too small to make a difference. So basically you can think of the post method as having a direct tunnel to your server, and you can send it information. So it's super easy, and you can use action functions if you want to get a little bit more complicated. So you can do customized processing logic, add loading spinners. There's a lot of different options. To show you that in the code, actually, you can see here, if I didn't lose it, there it is. So form. You can see here that method is post. Interestingly enough, do you see how it's wrapped around a button and it's literally just a form of one button? That's how it's kind of working under the hood. Like remember, stuff like buttons and things like that are all just forms really under the hood. So when this is clicked, the action that's taken is the /logout. So then that basically routes up to logout, and then it goes through the logic. So it's quite an interesting approach, and you can configure it to do some pretty powerful stuff, and it just makes it much easier than having to go through the whole process of messing around with either external libraries, or even having to build it yourself, or having to use event.prevent default, which as the Remix documentation website puts it, is who even knows what that does anyway. And I must confess, I don't know entirely what it does under the hood, and it's good to see the back of it, but I believe it like prevents like a hard refresh or something along those lines, but it makes your life much easier is the headline here. So this is actually what I probably like the most about Remix, the built-in functionality in stacks. So what is a stack? We talk full stack, front end, back end. A full stack, it's the same thing really as a Remix stack. So they're pre-configured sets of tools to use how you want. So there's 3 different main stacks that they have, and they're all named after music genres. So there's the Blue stack, which is a Node.js server with a PostgreSQL database. Grunge, which is serverless function using Node.js with DynamoDB. So that allows you to run on the AWS infrastructure. Grunge stack, if I was building the next $1 billion SaaS company, is probably what I would use. Indie stack, which is what I've actually been showing you just now. So that's again, a Node.js server. You're probably seeing a theme here, right? With a SQLite database, which is, ideal for experiments, MVPs. And what I probably should have put there as well is it's ideal for smaller scale projects. So yes, this is probably better if you're building something large, but if you want to make tests and do small things, then the Indie stack is the way to go. So we can see here, this is the Indie stack. So that's basically the landing page for it. So as you can see, I'm running this locally. Something actually I should mention, this is, it's basically an example blogging platform. So you can actually access this yourself if you clone the repo on the Remix website. So you see what I mentioned earlier about the functionality here. I'm creating a new note. Do you see how the URL is changing? I type something in. Sorry, my keyboard's to my side, so that's why I'm looking a bit wonky now. And then save it, then it automatically generates this with this nice new unique ID. So it's very cool and it's very easy. And what I love about that is it's just a super simple way to create something like a blogging website or something like that you maybe it's not overly complex, but you want to update it fairly frequently. So it's pretty cool in that respect, and something that I would recommend for that. But if we're talking like large scale SaaS products, definitely wouldn't go with the indie stack. I would lean towards grunge stack, but that's how I personally feel. I understand why a lot of people would go towards the blue stack. There are examples of all of these on the Remix website. Obviously, they're all free because it's open source, so I do recommend you just clone them. And even if you're not that familiar, just have a poke around and see how it all works. Sometimes one of the best ways to learn is to pick apart a complex code base that you're not that familiar with. It sometimes can be much harder to understand concepts if you're trying to build everything from the ground up yourself. So I would definitely recommend checking that out. So are there drawbacks? I'm not some kind of like crazy Remix evangelist that is going to tell you that like this is the perfect thing. No one's paying me. I use Next quite a bit, both in personal and professional capacity as well. So it's not like it's not like it's my absolute favorite thing that I've ever used, but I do just think it's so promising. However, there are going to be some drawbacks naturally. Like you have to make compromises somewhere. So small scale websites. I touched on that a minute ago. So for a certain type of small scale website, something that doesn't really change much, legacy documentation, archive data, or, something like something historical in general, or some pure information based thing. Like, for example, if I wanted to create a site for my rugby team where it talked about the history of the team, then I probably wouldn't use Remix because the history is probably not going to change much, right? But if I wanted to create one with quick match reports that I could quickly update every now and again, every week or two, then I would probably use the indie stack. So I hope that's a relatively clear example of like what I'm talking about, the difference here with the small scale website. Like, it's not a one size fits all solution. And there are points where it's like, this is really just overkill for what you need. So it can actually lead to performance issues due to the initial render. The reason why SSR is so good is in a large scale website, when there's so much going on, it's going to load quicker. But actually, in fact, if there's not very much going on, a simple, basic website is going to be better. And in fact, actually, there's a whole other conversation. But if you're building something super simple and you're not just trying to learn to code, it may be better to explore either a no-code or low-code solution. But that is a whole other talk and a whole other event, and something that I'm not as qualified to talk about, but I'd be very interested in attending. So as an example, I was going to rewrite a portfolio website here in Remix. So because the thing was, I wanted to do that, and I actually did start it, and I just thought this is totally overkill for what I actually want to show off on this event today. Because really, how much is actually going to change about me? Like, I'm not going to make too many changes to this website, maybe update it like every 6 months or so. So it's totally overkill compared to some of the examples I mentioned earlier. And the reason why I'm showing the Remix demo is because it's a perfect example by comparison. And obviously I don't have the open source of like a $1 billion SaaS company using it, but there are some large companies using it now. And for bigger infrastructure, it's pretty cool. And I'm not trying to say it's perfect, and I'm not trying to say don't use it for this small project. Like, definitely try it out. Like, it's so worth it. But if you're trying to like get something done just for the sake of getting it done, it's maybe not actually the best bet if it's a small static content that doesn't get updated much. So let's compare it to the other kid on the block, so to speak, NextJS. So it's a lot less mature than NextJS. Next has been around for quite a while. There's a clear ecosystem. I think version 12 is now out. So really, you've got version 1 versus version 12. There's a more refined solution there. So, if you want something more stable, I would strongly suggest, maybe leaning towards Next. It's also quite difficult to measure this really, but some unconfirmed reports has said that the Rust compiler, which Next uses, is actually quicker than Remix is. Although in reality, for the vast majority of use cases, the difference is going to be so tiny that really it's almost pedantic to talk about it in that respect. And it kind of just boils down to like whatever you actually prefer using. So Next is great as well, but if you prefer Remix, you prefer Remix, right? So Next also supports static site generation. So if that's a priority for you, you should either use Next or something like Gatsby. So static site generation is different from static site rendering. I know they're fairly similar sounding, and actually in reality, they are fairly similar. But something important to remember is static site generation means it doesn't render until build time, so it's not as good for SEO if I understand correctly. So that's why SSR is more powerful. But it's again, we're bordering on being pedantic here, but that's what web development's all about, really, isn't it? So also, I want to talk a little bit about the complexity, learning curve, and a bit about styling. So as I mentioned, there's a lot of people who are at different stages on their career on this call, particularly maybe people that know me from the coding career are learning to code at the moment. And if you're new to full stack JavaScript development, Remix does have a very steep learning curve. It's going to be quite complicated. There's going to be some stuff that you've not seen before. And I would say it can be quite intimidating. There's concepts that if you've not worked on a commercial code base before, that may be pretty tricky to understand. So if you're still learning the basics, then I'd maybe just suggest using something like Create React App with React Router, which obviously, as I mentioned earlier, the people that made React Router made Remix. So it's the kind of, it's in the same vein in the respect of like the style is similar, the influence is there, and it's the same ecosystem, right? So, you can definitely do that for sure. And in terms of styling, obviously, very few, I was going to say no one's a fan of styling. Very few developers are that fond of styling versus the logic side of things. So in my view, and perhaps I'm wrong on this, I believe that styling is a little bit overcomplicated in Remix and pretty over opinionated. So they don't let you use module-based CSS rules, I believe. There's no support for like CSS and JS. There's a major push for Tailwind. So obviously, as I mentioned, it's quite opinionated. Tailwind isn't for everyone. I understand why people like it, and I'm kind of getting used to it myself, but it can make your... the best way I can describe it is it can make your JSX look a bit messy, which obviously isn't great. But also as well, it can add to consistency across your application. So Tailwind, if you like it, then this is actually a plus. But if you don't like Tailwind, then obviously it's not going to be for you. I believe you can take Tailwind out, but they do really push towards it. So Tailwind, again, that's another thing. There's a whole other conversation to be had about whether you want to use that or not. Personally, I'm not entirely sold yet, but I am using it a bit in personal projects, and I see why it's useful and the consistency is good. So, I would say don't dive headfirst into this if you're still in the first couple of months of learning to code, because you will find it pretty challenging. And I would say that definitely make sure you've got a sort of Create React App style SPA off the ground first. So that's the way that if you go on the React documentation, that's the way they suggest I'll do it. So I'd say do one of those, see what you think. Use React Router for it, and then jump on to Remix, see what you think. Also, as well, check out Next. As I said, it's not like I work for Remix or anything like that. So, I would encourage people to try out both and see what works. But what I would say, and leaning more on what I do with the coder career, more and more companies are picking one of the two going forward, and it's the kind of thing that a lot of people that are trying to get their first job in tech don't know. So if you want to stand out and you're trying to get your first job, if you know either Next or Remix, it doesn't actually matter that much which one, because a lot of the concepts are actually the same. Then you're going to really stand out versus a lot of people on the market. So it's definitely something worth considering if you're trying to get your first job in tech, which I know a lot of people that follow me and listen to my podcast are trying to do. So really consider that as well. So obviously, as I mentioned about 10 times, I don't work for Remix. I'm not a contributor, but I do like their project. So I think, if you're curious about it and you want to find out more, I've listed some things here. So obviously check out the website. The main people to follow would be Michael Jackson, not that one, obviously, Ryan Florence and Kent C. Dodds. So you can check them out. They're all over Twitter, GitHub. They're not even just for this. They're just worth a follow in general because they do impart a lot of wisdom on the world of React. And if you're learning to code, particularly someone like Kent Dodds, a lot of his advice on things like testing have really helped me. And he does some really helpful webinars as well. So I would definitely recommend following all three of them to find out more information about Remix and see what they're working on, because all three of them provide excellent resources. Also, something to remember, as I mentioned earlier, Remix is open source. So I mentioned earlier about my little contribution to React Hook Form. You're never too small to make a difference. I'd only been coding for a couple of months when I did that, I think. So whether it's code or documentation, you should see if you can contribute if you do like it. So I would really encourage people to do that. As a side note, their documentation and their landing page is the perfect example of building a really good and solid website using Remix. At least I assume it's Remix. You would hope it is Remix. So I would definitely encourage people to check that out as well. So yeah, I think that's more or less rolling on to any questions now. You can find out all my information about the Coder Career on my link tree, which is linktr.ee/thecodercareer, and feel free to follow/connect with me on LinkedIn as well. So if anyone's got any questions, then please let me know now. I see we've got one through now, which is from Romeo. If you were to start from scratch, which programming languages would you start with? So obviously Remix itself not being a language, I would recommend that everyone you should learn HTML and CSS first, basically. Whether they're programming languages or not, again, it's a debate. After that, pick either JavaScript or Python, depending on what you want to do with your career. If you want to learn web technologies, then definitely go with JavaScript. Obviously, that leads on to React, which leads on to Remix. If you want to do more stuff on the data side of things, or more scripting, or if you just want to learn programming to make you better at your job, if you're not a programmer, then I'd recommend Python for sure. What do I think the future holds for React? That was a good question, anonymous attendee. So need to think about that for a minute. So I think the future for React is more solutions, basically like Remix and Next. React will go away eventually. Whether it will anytime soon, I don't think. I don't think so. So I expect we'll see more solutions like Remix and Next to crop up, and the ecosystem will get more mature over time. We're already seeing a point where, particularly for Next, mass corporate adoption is happening, and it does make the job much easier. So I think we'll see more of that. Over time for React, something like Svelte could perhaps overtake it. It's very difficult to say because we don't know, what's going to happen with that. Like, it is good to write, but it's kind of whether companies will adopt it. That's really the key. React kind of has had a stranglehold over the industry, unlike any other front-end technology, really. So it's definitely it's a really good question. And you know what? I'm gonna have a think about that, and I'm gonna maybe talk about it on a future podcast. I really like that question, and I want to do it some justice and do some more research. So little plug for my podcast there. I'll have a think about it. Are you aware of any companies adopting Remix? Thanks for the question, Elliot. Off the top of my head, I couldn't name any. They're mostly Silicon Valley ones, though. If you check out the Remix website, there's testimony from several companies that have adopted it. What I would say is, if someone's doing this if someone wants to learn it purely for employment purposes, I would say at the moment, if we're talking SSR, then go over to Next. I would advise. Next is much more widely adopted, and lots of product-focused tech companies in the UK are using Next. So if we're talking purely from an employment point of view, I would recommend learning Next before Remix, but it's Remix is still great to learn, but Next is more hold on the market. Give it a little while, because this tool has only been openly available for less than a year, which isn't much time, and then allow people to build some more greenfield products with it. I'd say, we'll see where that's at in 18 months. But yeah, I would say it's not the kind of thing that too many companies are using openly, certainly not in the UK at the moment. What other technologies do you enjoy working with? Do you recommend any other frameworks, etc.? Yeah, so I'm generally a huge JavaScript and TypeScript fan. I like Python as well. Python is an amazing language. If you're learning to code and you want something that is very versatile, then I would recommend Python for sure. Don't recommend any other frameworks. I would just say pick whatever framework interests you. Obviously, React is the best for employment. But ones that are particularly on the rise, stuff like Vue, Svelte, which I mentioned. Angular, for some reason, gets a bad rap. I actually think it's quite a nice tool. But I would say for employment purposes, the two best at the moment would be React and Vue. Obviously as well, Node.js, but that's not a front end technology, but it's still in JavaScript. So definitely worth learning Node.js, similarly to Python for similar reasons, really. What are your thoughts on potential breaking changes? React Router are an example of themselves breaking changes. Yeah, good question, Alex. That is one of the biggest things that turned me off React Router, actually. Making breaking changes, unless strictly necessary, I'm really not a fan of it. Sometimes it's necessary. If there is going to be such a performance upgrade, then obviously it's a trade-off, and you've got to decide, is it worth it to do it? And I would say, their new version was good, but whether they needed to go and do that breaking change, I don't know. I would say, it's definitely something to watch out for. Obviously, this team, as much as I like them and I like the product they've worked on, they have shown that they've done that before. Obviously, you can stay on the older version, I believe, but it is, it's definitely something to be aware of, and the fact that you may need to continue to maintain it down the line for sure. Jack asks, would Remix work well with Django and Python? Not explored it yet, but may have inspired me to have a play. Yeah. So the short answer is it's built with Node.js in mind, but I believe it is agnostic enough that I believe you can use other stuff. I'm not sure about Python and Django specifically, but I do know Deno, which is which is basically a new competitor to Node. And in fact, actually, I think Ryan Dahl, who created Node, also created Deno, which for the smart people among us will have realized is an anagram of Node. So I know that it works with Deno. As for Python and Django, I'm not 100% sure, but there's a good chance it will. So definitely check out the documentation for sure. If not, do remember that like Node.js is actually fairly similar to Python. Obviously, there's slight syntax differences, but from my experience going back and forth to JavaScript and Python, I don't find too difficult. So definitely don't if it turns out you can't use it, then don't let that discourage you, because I'd highly recommend it. And obviously, if anyone's got any more questions, either now, you can pop them in the chat, or if not, then you can reach out to me at a later date as well. I see there's a chat icon as well. Just see if there's any questions I missed on there. Cool. Sorry, I missed your question, Samira, because it came through on the other one. For blogs including articles and news posts on a weekly basis, would you recommend IndieStack? Really good question. I would say, yeah, I would say it's a good one. Particularly, obviously, we're all learning to code here, right? Well, you're always learning to code if you're a software engineer. So definitely, I would say it's a really good option. The IndieStack example that I showed, you can adapt that and use that. It would be a really good way to adapt to use for some kind of blog, maybe explain like articles like you're suggesting, articles on a weekly basis, then yeah, I would say IndieStack could be an excellent choice for that. For sure. It's a much less clunky version of something like WordPress. So yeah, absolutely. And that is a perfect use case for something like IndieStack. So yeah, I couldn't have given a better example myself. So great one there. Cool. So I think that is all. One more question. Would you say DynamoDB is popular among companies? Yes. Thanks for the question, Carrie. Yeah, I would say DynamoDB is very popular. So it's by AWS, so Amazon Web Services. So for anyone that knows how much AWS has a market share, many companies that use AWS also use DynamoDB. From personal experience, I've seen it a lot. So yeah, I would say DynamoDB is very popular. And as a general point, I know this is a remix talk, but if you're going to learn one cloud platform, I would say probably learn AWS. It's probably got the biggest market share, and obviously DynamoDB is a part of that. So definitely check it out, and but make sure you use the free tier and make sure you set up some billing alarms. So you don't do what I did and go away on holiday and run up a huge bill without realizing you shouldn't check your phone. But yeah, I think, is that it for questions?
I think
that so, yeah.
Yeah, I think that might be everything, unless anybody's got any sort of last minute questions. Now is your chance. But thank you so much anyway, Cameron. That was an absolutely brilliant presentation, really insightful. Like I say, React, there's I know you couldn't really give sort of too much of an answer on the future of React, because who knows? It's absolutely mad. I've been in the sort of tech sector for sort of 5 years now, and even just seeing the change from a sort of recruitment and events sort of side, it's absolutely crazy. So it's great to sort of get an insight into a Remix run. So yeah, I mean, I don't think there's any sort of last minute questions. Obviously I know that you've got your podcast as well. So I mean, send me over the link in the morning. I'll send it out to everybody so everybody can sort of listen in as well. And I'll sort of send out your LinkedIn profile as well, just in case anybody has any sort of question in the future. This is actually being recorded as well, so it'll be posted onto YouTube. So if you want to go back and watch it, I'll send over the link in an email tomorrow. So yeah, I mean, thank you so much for everybody who's attended as well. Some really great questions in the sort of Q&A and the chat box there. So once again, thank you very much, Cameron. It's been an absolute pleasure having you.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure to be invited. It was great to take part, and yeah, if anyone's looking for a job, they should definitely reach out to you guys for sure. Because yeah, it's great. It's great you're putting on events like this for the community, and myself, and I'm sure all the guests really appreciate it. So thank you.
Oh, thank you so much for the shout out. We've got, I mean, not to sort of give a little pitch or anything like that, but we have sort of multiple sort of roles. Nothing with Remix Run, unfortunately, but plenty with sort of React on a whole. So if anybody is looking for sort of opportunities in the UK, please do get in touch with myself. My name's Lucy Kay, and we have Sophie here, Sophie Newton. So feel free to drop us a message. And like I say, I'll put in Cameron's LinkedIn in an email tomorrow, so anybody, I mean, I hope you don't mind, Cameron, I'm just sort of
absolutely.
I'm giving out
I want to get the word out. Yeah.
that's if you don't mind. Yeah, I'll send out your LinkedIn so anybody wants to sort of connect in, because it's so niche as well. You sort of haven't written, not many people have heard of sort of Remix Run, so I'm sure people might have questions later on. So yeah, I mean, once again, thank you very much, and hope you all have a lovely evening.
Thank you, everyone.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Bye.